thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for being with us as Devex begins our coverage of the UN General Assembly. I'm really pleased to be joined with António Guterres, who is the, of course, Secretary General of the UN. Thank you for spending some time with us,
it's
Mr.
a pleasure.
Secretary General.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You know, this is an unusual year. We would normally be doing this in person, and this is, of course, would be the 75th anniversary of the General Assembly, maybe a celebratory moment. It feels like anything but that. You were quoted in a recent speech saying that we are, quote, at a breaking point. Give us a sense as you begin this General Assembly, what your message is to the gathering world leaders, at least virtually gathering, to the development and humanitarian community watching, as to what is the current state of the world as you see it.
I think that this pandemic has clearly demonstrated how fragile we are. We are as a world, as a global community. We are as humankind. Fragility in relation to pandemics. We see a microscopic virus that has put us on our knees. Fragility in relation to climate change that we had not addressed properly in the past. Fragility in relation to the lawlessness in the cyberspace and other aspects of the technological developments. Even nuclear proliferation is a risk again. So we are extremely fragile. And when we are fragile, we must be humble. And we must understand that to overcome these fragilities, we need to unite in solidarity. Unfortunately, we are not seeing that unity. We see the response to the pandemic being done by each country alone, sometimes with contradictory strategies, and so the virus has moved from east to west, from north to south. It can come back. There are second waves. And obviously, when countries move in opposite directions, the virus moves in every direction. But also we have not shown solidarity. Not enough solidarity. I've been saying since the beginning that a massive rescue package was necessary, of 2 digits of the global economy. The truth is that the developed world is doing that. Most of the countries in the global north are applying rescue packages of that dimension, 10, 12% of GDP. But the south is in trouble. There has been very little solidarity with the South. There was a suspension of debt payments for 2020 in relation to the least developed countries. It's not enough. We need it prolonged, and we need it to all developing and middle-income countries that are extremely vulnerable at the present moment, have no access to financial markets, and are facing a debt crisis. And on the other hand, the mobilization of resources through international financial institutions has not been enough, or through bilateral aid. I've advocated at a certain moment for the issuance of a new package of special drawing rights. This was not approved. And there has been a massive injection of liquidity, of course, in the systems in the developed world. But that liquidity is not coming to many of the developing countries that face extremely challenging situations. Now, fragile situation, lack of unity and lack of solidarity, we are in trouble and we need to change course.
Mr. Secretary General, let's zone in on one specific aspect of this, which is a vaccine. It's obviously getting a lot of attention, yet there are real concerns that vaccine nationalism will be the way that vaccines are largely distributed around the world, and that the richest countries will sign deals and get access, and that the poorest countries, the most vulnerable people, will not. Is this a real concern for you today as you speak with world leaders, as you get engaged in fundraising around vaccine development? Is your sense that vaccine nationalism will be the way forward here, that vaccines will not be equally distributed?
It is one of my major concerns at the present moment. There is a very important initiative, the so-called ACT Accelerator, the COVAX, and that initiative aims, and it has brought together the World Health Organization, Gavi, the Global Fund, and many other institutions, a number of countries, the European Union, and it aims to develop, to produce and then to distribute not only vaccines, also treatments and testing systems, but with the aim to have vaccines that are developed, produced and distributed to be available and affordable everywhere. The COVAX is working hard. I would say that the technical work is being done quite well. The problem is money. The This has received about $2.7 billion. This requires about $35 billion. At the same time, we see several countries making their own contracts with producers that are developing vaccines in order to satisfy the needs of their own populations. Now, my appeal is that independently of the efforts that countries are doing for their own populations, it's absolutely essential to finance the COVAX in order for the COVAX to be able to support those developing countries that have not the possibility to ensure the access of their populations directly to a vaccine. We need a vaccine that is a global public good, what we usually call a people's vaccine. And for that, we need to fund the COVAX. We need to mobilize the resources that are needed for all the work that is being done in very close cooperation by so many entities to be able to be successful.
Before this pandemic, we would have been using this moment to talk about a decade of action, 2020, 10 years to go before the end of the SDGs. And instead, this pandemic has set us back. We're going backwards on many of the SDGs. And as you just described, Mr. Secretary General, we're not even able to raise the funds for something like a vaccine, which has direct and immediate benefits for the richest countries in the world. What are the prospects of actually the SDGs remaining relevant in a context of such climate disruption, pandemic, unrest, and conflict around the world? Are you still confident in the SDGs as the framework we should be using going forward?
Well, they are more relevant than ever, because it's exactly because we had not made enough progress in the SDGs that we are as fragile as we are. And the answer to fragility lies in being able to implement the Sustainable Development Goals and to reach the objectives of the Agenda 2030. But let's have no illusions. We are seeing, in many aspects, a movement backwards. Hunger and poverty are increasing in the world again. And I've heard some people saying that in certain areas we can move backwards 25 years or more. So we are facing a very serious problem. The only way, in my opinion, to move forward is to concentrate all this massive mobilization of resources that is taking place, even if not in a very fair distribution at the present moment, but these massive concentration of resources, these trillions that are being mobilized, both to the response to the pandemic and to the economic and social impacts of the pandemic and to the beginning of the recovery, to make sure that this massive mobilization of resources is aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, it depends on the way we are going to spend the money. If we spend the money to reestablish, for instance, energy production based on fossil fuels, we are undermining our future. If we spend that money betting on the green economy, betting on renewable energy, which, by the way, is cheaper and more profitable, then we are moving simultaneously with the recovery and with the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the same can be said about all the other aspects, from education to health. Are we going to move into universal health coverage? Have we understood the fragility of our health systems? Or are we going to do just ad hoc investments here and there without the understanding that we need really a new systematic way to respond to pandemics like this? So it's my belief that if it is possible for leaders to understand that this problem must be transformed into an opportunity and to mobilize the resources that are being spent to do it aligned with the Paris Agreement, aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, aligned essentially with the values of the Charter, then I think there is a chance. If on the contrary, we see nationalism and populism winning, we see everyone doing what everyone thinks is better and investing, trying to reestablish exactly the kind of economy and society we had in the past, then the Sustainable Development Goals will suffer a dramatic blow.
Let's stay on the same. I wanted to get your take on the WHO, how they are doing now in the course of this pandemic. Of course, we all know the U.S. government indicated its desire to withdraw and submitted papers to you to that effect. Devex has been covering these new plans by the U.S. government to create its own pandemic response unit inside the State Department, which some say could actually undermine the WHO and its work. I wonder if you have a message about how you think the WHO is doing at this stage during the pandemic.
What I witness more directly, which is the work that WHO and the staff of WHO is doing around the world to support developing countries the massive mobilization of equipments, the massive mobilization, the huge logistics effort that WHO, together with all the network of the UN agencies, the logistics network of the UN agencies that was put together, the enormous support in testing, the enormous support in protection equipment, the enormous support in medicine, the enormous support in medical equipment. If we see at the same time the way WHO is helping governments, especially in the developing world, to create strategies to respond to the pandemic, I think we need to recognize that this is a gigantic effort. But of course, it is clear that there are things that need to be looked at, there are things that need to be improved, and that is why there is a panel that was created, led by Annan Clark and the former president of Liberia, Ellen Sirleaf. And the objective of this panel is exactly to look into how both WHO and the other international organizations and member states need to review the way they have acted in relation to the COVID-19 to make sure that in the future, when we will face other pandemics, we respond much better than when we responded now. But one thing for me is clear. Our main problem is not in the World Health Organization. Our main problem is in the fact that many of the countries do not simply follow the recommendations of the World Health Organizations and do whatever they find is their way. And those ways have shown the contradictions that we are witnessing and the lack of capacity of a coordinated effort to defeat the pandemic. And we are now seeing the results of that with the growing concerns that in the global north are again about the second wave.
For so much of the world, the pandemic itself may not be just the biggest threat on its own. It may be the economic and political repercussions of it. And I'm particularly referring to the lowest income countries in the world. We can remember with Ebola that more people were killed from other diseases and from the economic repercussions than from the disease itself. When you think of the timeline of this pandemic and those secondary and tertiary repercussions, how far out do you think this is going to go in terms of the negative impact on the poorest countries in the world and on the work of development and humanitarian actors in this space?
I think there are two scenarios that are possible. One is the optimistic one. Let us imagine that all of a sudden the G20 is able in the next summit to seriously address the problems of debt, to seriously mobilize the liquidities necessary to support the developing world, to seriously create the conditions for a vaccine that is a people's vaccine, a global public good. Let's imagine that this happens. We all agree that's what should happen, but we all know that it's not so easy. But let's imagine that this happens. If that is the case, I believe that in 2 to 3 years' time, it will be possible to progressively come, I wouldn't say to a perfectly re-established situation, but come to a moment of progress and hope that the future is possible. But let's imagine that doesn't happen, that the developing countries are left largely to themselves, that there is no effective coordination in the use of a vaccine. I think we might have a long cycle, not only for the developing countries, a global cycle of 5 to 7 years, eventually even a depression. Not only a series of recessions, but a depression, with many countries coming to insolvency and the dramatic impacts and consequences in global financial systems. So it's time to put our act together. It's time to understand that we need unity and solidarity, both in the economic and financial mechanisms put in place to guarantee an effective recovery, and in the coordination of what is needed to make sure that we are effective fighting the pandemic. And as you mentioned, the vaccine is absolutely crucial on that. A vaccine available and affordable to all.
We talked a bit about funding, but mostly from governments. Your colleague, David Beasley, who's the head of the World Food Program, said this week that he thinks billionaires need to step up in a bigger way. He was referring to the number of children in the world that are falling into hunger. I wonder if you want to add your own voice to that, or what your take is. You know, there are 2,000 billionaires in the world, many of whom have gotten much richer during the pandemic. Do you feel they're stepping up to the degree they should, or what message would you have for the community of the wealthiest people in the world and what they ought to be doing right now?
Well, my first message is to governments. Billionaires should be taxed effectively. And there should be international cooperation to make sure that we are able to tax the huge creation of wealth that is happening and is largely untaxed, as you know, in the present moment, especially in the technology sectors. So, independently of what should be and must be an appeal for the generosity of billionaires to be able to understand the need to also feel that their resources also belong to the world as a whole, and to be able to invest in humanitarian action, to invest in support to developing countries in different areas or to vulnerable communities. Independently of that, we need to have a world in which wealth and income are properly taxed in a coordinated way. And that, I think, is something we shouldn't forget. Charity is very important, but justice is even more important. On the other hand, I think it's very useful that all international organizations establish partnerships with foundations, with charities, with all kinds of elements. And there is, I would say, another area that I would consider different from this aspect of the billionaires. I see more and more companies, I see more and more financial institutions, asset managers understanding that it is in their interest to invest in line with the Sustainable Development Goals, and especially to invest in line with carbon neutrality in 2050. And this movement gives me hope that governments will also understand that and will be able to make some positive choices in the months and years to come.
I've been struck. I was looking at your speech that you gave, the Mandela speech in July, and some of the other comments you've been giving during the course of this pandemic about the forcefulness of the terms you're using, the tone you're using. This is not something maybe anyone could have expected in your term as UN Secretary General. How do you see this crisis changing your term as Secretary General? Should we be expecting a different António Guterres, a different Secretary General, as a result of this pandemic, a more outspoken voice on these issues as we see global leadership perhaps wane in the multilateral space? Tell us about whether you think this is changing your term as Secretary General.
I don't see it on a personal dimension. I see it more globally. We all have changed. We are all living in a different way. We are all doing different things. We have been enormously impacted by this pandemic. And let's understand that we can, changing, also create the conditions to respond better in the future. And so this creates a responsibility to the Secretary General of the United Nations, creates a responsibility to all leaders in the world, political leaders, economic leaders, leaders of civil society, creates a responsibility to citizens. I mean, let's take profit of the changes that we are ourselves feeling in our lives to be able to move things with more strength and more energy in the right direction.
You see an opportunity in this crisis, in other words. There's a chance to perhaps come out of what feels like a very dark moment with a new sense of global solidarity?
Well, sometimes people say that politicians are the animals that are experts in transforming opportunities into problems. I think it's time for leaders in the world to become experts in transforming problems into opportunities.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary General. We very much appreciate you taking the time to help us kick off our coverage of the General Assembly here at Devex. Our community of development and health and humanitarian practitioners around the world are certainly listening to your comments very closely in a very challenging moment in the world today. 10 years left to go on the SDGs. Significant challenges in front of people who are working in the lowest income, most vulnerable communities in the world. So thank you for your leadership and for taking some time to be with us today.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be with you again.